You're dead meat, you broke bitch. No lawyer can save you now. Jason leaned heavily over the thick wooden divider of the defendant's table. His breath washed over my face. Stale Folgers, coffee, and cheap alcohol-heavy aftershave. He was 35 now, carrying a sagging beer gut that strained the plastic buttons of an off-the-rack suit he probably bought at a strip mall. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean back. My spine remained exactly 2 inches from the back of the hard wooden chair. Both hands rested flat on the table, right wrist crossed cleanly over the left. I locked my eyes directly onto his right earlobe. It's a trick you learn when you don't want to give an enemy the satisfaction of eye contact, but you need them to feel the crushing weight of your stare. I counted my breaths. Inhale. 2. 3. Exhale. To my left, Arthur sat in the plaintiff's row. My father. He let out a low, wet chuckle, crossing his thick arms over his chest. He looked at me the way a man looks at a stray dog that just wandered onto his freshly paved driveway. Next to them, Richard Lawson leaned back in a $1,000 leather chair, a shark in a pinstripe suit. He casually spun a black Mont Blanc pen between his manicured fingers. Lawson loved cases like this. He took one look at me, a woman showing up to probate court without legal representation, a pro se defendant in a cheap blouse, and saw nothing but an easy paycheck. He assumed I was broke. He assumed I lacked the basic intelligence to understand federal probate law. The courtroom smelled like damp pine sol, old oak, and nervous sweat. Up on the towering bench, Judge Harold Bennett adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at Lawson. He didn't look at Arthur. He cracked open a thick, red-stamped personnel file. The entire room fell into a suffocating dead silence, but my mind wasn't in that courtroom. The nauseating smell of Jason's aftershave dragged me backward. 16 years backward, Ohio, mid-July. The thick, greasy smell of backyard barbecue smoke clinging to the humid air. Crash. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the narrow kitchen. Jason, 19 years old and full of unearned arrogance, had just thrown a baseball straight through Mom's vintage floral vase. Pieces of painted clay scattered across the cheap linoleum floor. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. Arthur stormed into the kitchen. He took one look at the mess, grabbed Jason by the shoulder, and physically shoved the boy behind his own broad back. A human shield protecting his golden child. Then his eyes snapped to me. I was standing at the sink, my hands buried in soapy dishwater. "You're the older sister," Arthur barked, his voice hitting me like buckshot. "Why the hell aren't you watching him? You let him destroy your mother's things. You are completely irresponsible." He didn't ask Jason why he threw it. He didn't care. It was my fault. It was always my fault. I looked over at Mom. She was sitting at the small dining table, her head bowed, staring blankly at a plate of mushy peas. She didn't say a word. She never did. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just gripped the yellow sponge in my hand, squeezing it until the dirty, lukewarm dishwater ran down my wrist and dripped onto the floor. Right then and there, a concrete wall started pouring its foundation in my mind. I realized my exact purpose in this house. I was the spare part, the silent shock absorber for their dysfunction. Months later, that dysfunction paid out in full for Jason. He got a brand new Ford F-150. A reward from Arthur for barely scraping a passing grade and getting accepted into a bottom-tier community college. The night he brought the truck home, the house was loud with celebration. I wasn't inside. I was sitting out behind the detached garage in the dark, picking rust off a busted lawnmower blade with a flathead screwdriver. The metal slipped. I sliced my knuckle. I didn't care. The sharp sting kept me grounded. I didn't hear him approach. Combat boots don't make a sound on gravel if you know how to walk. Colonel William Barnes, my grandfather. A Vietnam veteran who spoke less in a month than Arthur did in an hour. He stepped out of the shadows and lowered his heavy frame onto an overturned aluminum drum. He didn't coddle me. He didn't offer a bandage for my bleeding hand. Instead, he tossed a freezing cold can of ginger ale at my chest. I caught it. The icy condensation bit into my skin. He stared at me for a long time. His eyes were hard, calculating. "You know why they're wrong about you, Millie." His voice was gravel grinding over asphalt. because they're using a yardstick made of trash to measure solid steel. That was it. He stood up and walked away into the dark. That steel got tested soon enough. When I deployed to Afghanistan, the reality of my family's greed followed me into the dirt. I spent my days breathing in cordite diesel fuel and the metallic stench of blood. Every month, I wired 70% of my hazard combat pay back to an Ohio bank account. I thought I owed them. I thought it was my duty as the spare child to buy my way into their grace. 2 weeks into a brutal rotation in Kandahar, I managed to get 10 minutes of internet access at the base. I opened Facebook. There was Jason grinning like an idiot sitting astride a brand new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The caption read, "Paid in cash. Living the dream. My blood money." I stared at the glowing screen. The desert heat was pushing 110 degrees outside the tent, but I felt nothing but ice in my veins. I didn't call them. I didn't demand the money back. I simply opened my banking portal and permanently locked the account. Cut the cord. Let them bleed dry. But the real death of my family ties happened long before the desert. It happened on a freezing Tuesday morning at a Greyhound bus station. Ohio snow was blowing sideways, cutting like broken glass. I stood on the salted concrete, my olive-drab Marine Corps duffel bag slung over my shoulder. No family send-off. No tearful hugs from a proud mother. Just the colonel. He stood perfectly straight in the freezing wind, raising his hand in a crisp, silent salute. I returned it. Down the curb, the family SUV idled. The engine rumbled low. Arthur rolled down the passenger window just a few inches. A thick, suffocating cloud of cheap cigar smoke billowed out into the winter air. He didn't look me in the eye. He just pointed the glowing orange tip of his cigar at me through the crack in the window. 6 months, he sneered, the words dripping with absolute disgust. You'll come crawling back to this house begging to eat off my table. If you've ever been the black sheep, the one who gave your blood and sweat only to be treated like a walking ATM by the people who were supposed to love you, drop a 1 in the comments right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know. I'm not the only one who had to pack a bag and walk into the freezing cold just to survive. He didn't wait for an answer. The motorized window whined as it rolled up, sealing the warm cabin. The heavy glass shut with a dull thud. But right before it closed, slicing through the howl of the Ohio wind, I heard the wet, unmistakable sound of his smirk. Crunch. Loose, dry dirt hit the lid of the cheap pine coffin. The county cemetery was entirely empty except for us and 2 men leaning on their shovels. An early October wind ripped through the endless rows of gray headstones, carrying the bitter scent of dead leaves and cold rain. I stood at the very edge of the open grave, my spine locked into a perfectly straight, unyielding line. I wore my service alphas. The dark green fabric of my Marine Corps uniform felt like a layer of armor against the biting wind. I brought my right hand up in a slow, precise 45-degree salute. I held it there. I did not blink. I did not shiver. I barely breathed. 3 steps to my left stood Jason. He wore a black suit that looked like it was 2 sizes too small. The cheap fabric stretched tight across his expanding gut. His head was bowed, but he was not looking at the hole in the ground. He had his smartphone cupped in his left hand, shielded from the wind. His thumb swiped rhythmically across the glowing screen. He was checking the morning stock tickers. A few feet behind him, Arthur stood near a pathetic, sparse wreath of wilted white lilies. He was not looking at the grave either. He was busy shaking hands with his hardware store business partner. They were standing in a graveyard, murmuring about supply chain margins and quarterly tax write-offs. Nobody was looking at the wooden box. Nobody cared that a giant of a man who had bled in the suffocating jungles of Vietnam, was going into the cold Ohio ground. They were just waiting for the dirt to settle so they could get to the reading of the will. I stared down into this dark earth. I remembered standing on a scorching tarmac in Kandahar, the heat radiating through the thick soles of my combat boots. I remembered watching aluminum transfer cases draped perfectly in the American flag being loaded into the dark belly of a C-17 transport plane. Death in a combat zone carried a crushing, silent weight. It demanded absolute reverence. When a soldier died, the world stopped spinning for a minute. Death back home, surrounded by blood relatives, just reeked of cheap calculations and hidden agendas. 2 hours later, we were sitting in a cramped wood-paneled conference room at a local estate attorney's office. The outdated air conditioning unit in the window rattled constantly, struggling and failing to cool the small oppressive space. The room smelled like stale coffee ozone from an overworked copy machine and the sharp chemical scent of fresh printer ink. Arthur sat at the head of the heavy glass conference table. He had his chest puffed out, taking up as much space as possible. He was ready to claim his kingdom. Jason sat next to him, aggressively tapping the sole of his loafer against the carpeted floor. He had already pulled up a web browser on his phone, looking at a listing for a luxury pontoon boat. The old estate lawyer, a man who looked entirely worn down by decades of witnessing family greed, adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He picked up a crisp white stack of legal paper. The sharp rustle of the pages cut right through the dull hum of the air conditioner. He read through the standard legal jargon. The funeral arrangements, the settlement of outstanding debts. Nobody cared about that part. We all sat in this freezing room waiting for the asset distribution. The lawyer cleared his throat. He looked down at the final page. Regarding the totality of the estate, the liquid assets held in the Federal Credit Union, the Mutual Fund Trust, and the property located on Lake Erie. The sole and exclusive beneficiary is... The lawyer paused, looking up over the rim of his glasses. Millie Barnes. The rattle of the air conditioning unit suddenly sounded as loud as a jet engine. The room went completely terrifyingly dead. Thud. Jason's phone slipped from his sweaty fingers and hit the industrial carpet. His mouth fell wide open. He stared at the lawyer with empty, uncomprehending eyes. The pontoon boat vanished from his mind. I did not look at him. I shifted my gaze straight to Arthur. The smug color drained from his face for exactly 1 second. Then a dark, violent red rushed up his thick neck and settled deep into his cheeks. A thick blue vein at his right temple began to throb rapidly against his skin. The script of the Golden Child had just been torn to shreds from 6 feet under the ground. The shock mutated into pure, unhinged rage. Arthur slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the glass table. The brutal impact rattled the coffee mugs. He lunged forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. He thrust his right index finger across the glass, pointing it directly at the space between my eyes like the barrel of a loaded gun. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was a low, dangerous growl. Sparks of spit flew from his lips. "You went out there to see him. You got into that old man's head. You manipulated his brain, you treacherous little snake. You tricked a dying man." Jason snapped out of his trance. He leaned over the table, his face twisted in ugly panic. "That money is mine. Grandpa promised me that lake house. I need that money to pay off the truck. You cannot do this. You stole it." He started cursing, slamming his fist against his thigh. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against the accusations. I knew the truth. I sat perfectly still. My eyes tracked a small hairline fracture in the glass surface of the table. Then I looked up. I locked my vision onto the throbbing pulse in Arthur's thick neck. I evaluated his heart rate, approximately 130 beats per minute. Elevated blood pressure, shallow, rapid breathing, poor physical conditioning. He was a man entirely losing control of his environment. I was a woman who had been trained to control environments that were actively trying to kill me. I slowly reached out and picked up the white piece of paper detailing the asset distribution. The heavy cardstock felt solid in my hand. A slick, arrogant voice interrupted the shouting. Richard Lawson, Arthur's hired legal shark, stepped out of the corner of the room. He walked up to the table, his expensive leather shoes silent on the carpet. He casually slid a single sheet of paper across the glass toward me. "Let us be reasonable here, Miss Barnes," Lawson said. His tone was coated in a sickening layer of fake sympathy. It was a brutal threat wrapped in a friendly recommendation. "This is clearly a clerical error or a document signed under severe mental duress. If you try to fight this, we will tie this entire estate up in probate court for the next 10 years. You will go bankrupt just paying the filing fees. Just sign the waiver, renounce the claim, save yourself the time and the humiliation." I looked down at the waiver. It was a formal surrender document, a white flag printed on legal paper. I reached into the chest pocket of my dark green uniform. My fingers wrapped around the cold, knurled aluminum of my black tactical pen. I pulled it out and clicked the top. Arthur smirked. He crossed his arms. He thought he had won. He thought I was folding just like I did when I was a teenager in his kitchen. Jason let out a shaky, arrogant breath of relief. I held the tip of the pen over the signature line for 3 seconds. Then I flicked my wrist. I used the back of my hand to brush the waiver off the edge of the table. It fluttered down and landed face down on the dirty carpet right next to Jason's loafers. I clicked the pen shut. I slid it back into my pocket. See you in court. I stood up. I pushed the heavy leather chair back with the backs of my knees. I squared my shoulders, keeping my back completely straight. I turned away from them and walked toward the heavy oak door. You do not have a dime to hire a lawyer, you stupid bitch. Jason screamed at my back, his voice cracking with raw desperation. He slammed his fist against the wall. Lawson is going to bury you. I did not stop. I did not look back. I grabbed the cold brass handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The purge had officially begun. Lawson loved the sound of his own voice. It was the first day of the probate hearing. The county courtroom smelled like lemon pledge and old varnished oak. Richard Lawson stepped out from behind the plaintiff's table and took center stage. He wore a custom dark navy Italian wool suit that probably cost more than a used car. His black leather Oxfords squeaked slightly on the polished hardwood floor. He hooked his thumbs into his vest pockets, puffing his chest out. He was playing to the gallery. He was playing to the judge. Your Honor, the defendant is proceeding pro se. Lawson let the Latin phrase hang in the air, coating it in thick, undeniable condescension. He pointed a manicured finger in my direction. A complete disregard for the legal process. She has no formal education in estate law. She is unequipped, emotionally volatile, and entirely incapable of managing an estate of this magnitude. Behind him in the first row of the gallery, Jason sat with a smug, oily grin plastered across his face. He leaned over and nudged Arthur with his elbow. Arthur gave a slow, arrogant nod, crossing his heavy arms over his chest. They were enjoying the show. They paid top dollar for a hitman in a pinstripe suit, and he was delivering. I did not react. I did not glare at them. I kept my back locked exactly 2 inches from the wood of my chair. My hands rested flat on the defense table. I held a cheap plastic mechanical pencil. Click, click. I pressed the lead down and wrote on my yellow legal pad. My handwriting was blocky, tight, and completely uniform. Hearsay. Character assassination. Irrelevant to asset distribution. I processed his insults the exact same way I processed hostile reconnaissance. You do not get angry at enemy fire. You track the trajectory. You find the origin. You neutralize the threat. For 2 solid hours, Lawson ran his mouth. He paced back and forth, gesturing with a thick black Mont Blanc pen. He called me an estranged failure. He painted a picture of a lonely, bitter woman clinging to her grandfather's coattails, completely ignorant of how the real world worked. He wanted a reaction. He was waiting for me to crack. He wanted the crazy, emotional woman to stand up, scream, and prove his point to the judge. I gave him nothing. I just sat there. I kept my face dead neutral. I raised my eyes and locked my vision directly onto the soft tissue of Lawson's throat, right on his Adam's apple. I did not blink. I did not look away when he made eye contact. I just stared right through him. Silence is a brutal weapon. Most civilians cannot handle it. They are conditioned to talk to fill the empty air, to seek validation. When you give them nothing but a dead, unblinking stare, their primitive brain registers it as a predatory threat. I learned that in interrogation rooms in Kandahar. It works just as well in Ohio. By 11:30 a.m., the temperature in the courtroom hadn't changed, but Lawson was sweating. A single cold drop rolled from his hairline down his left temple. He wiped it away quickly with the back of his hand. He cleared his throat. He stopped pacing. He retreated behind his wooden podium, gripping the edges until his knuckles turned white. She lacks the basic comprehension to execute the trust. Lawson stammered. He looked at me. I kept my eyes fixed on his throat. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. The shark was drowning in 2 feet of water. The lunch recess came and went. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut. The rattling of the commercial AC unit hummed loudly in the background. Judge Harold Bennett stepped up to the massive wooden bench. His black robe billowed slightly around his ankles. He sat down. He did not look at Arthur. He did not look at Lawson. Bennett reached out and pulled a thick manila folder from the very bottom of his stack. It was not a standard county probate file. It was secured with a metal clasp. A thick diagonal red stripe ran across the front cover. The official seal of the United States Department of Defense was stamped dead center. The sharp, crisp sound of Bennett turning the first heavy page cut through the silent room. "Counselor Lawson," Bennett said. His voice was flat, carrying the cold, unforgiving authority of a former military prosecutor. "In your opening statement, you asserted that Miss Barnes lacks the legal competence to handle this estate." Lawson puffed out his chest, desperately trying to recover his morning swagger. "That is correct, Your Honor. She is a civilian with no legal background. She is entirely out of her depth." Bennett slowly took off his wire-rimmed glasses. He placed them on the sounding block. He stared down at Lawson with absolute disgust. "Miss Barnes is a senior investigator for the United States Marine Corps." The words dropped like a concrete block onto the hardwood floor. The AC unit kept rattling. Nobody breathed. Arthur leaned forward, his heavy jaw hanging open. Jason froze. His eyes darted frantically between Lawson, the judge, and me. Bennett looked back down at the red-stamped file. "She holds a flawless certification in federal military law. She spent the last 4 years deployed overseas, running high-level logistics, criminal investigations, and legal oversight for a combat battalion. Furthermore," Bennett continued, his voice rising, echoing across the vaulted ceiling, "according to her service record, she has successfully prosecuted 3 separate department-level financial fraud cases. She tracks missing millions in black-budget logistics." Bennett finally looked right at Lawson. His eyes were like chipped ice. "Her ability to read a financial ledger is significantly sharper than yours, Counselor." Bang! The wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block. The sound cracked like a rifle shot. It was an invisible backhand right across the plaintiff's table. "She does not need a lawyer." Lawson's body went completely rigid. All the blood drained out of his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His posture collapsed. His hand went slack. Clatter. The heavy black Mont Blanc pen slipped from his manicured fingers and hit the floor. It rolled under the defense table. He did not bend down to pick it up. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Behind him, Jason stammered, his voice high, thin, and terrified. Military law. What is he talking about, Dad? What is he talking about?" Arthur did not answer. He was gripping the wooden pew in front of him, his knuckles white, staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead. The arrogant illusion was shattered. The game was over. The predator had just realized he walked into a locked cage with a monster. The gallery erupted into a low, shocked murmur. Bennett glared at the crowd until it went dead silent again. I did not smile. I did not look back at my father or my brother to gloat. I didn't feel a single ounce of victory. I just closed my eyes. Lawson and Jason heard the titles. They heard the prestige and the authority. They thought it was a flex. But in the total darkness behind my eyelids, there was no courtroom. There was no judge. There was no vindication. There was only the deafening, bone-shattering roar of an incoming 120mm mortar shell tearing the earth apart. The smell of burning sand. The copper stench of fresh blood soaking into a stretcher. The high-pitched, endless screaming of an 18-year-old kid begging for his mother. The gavel cracked again, but in my head it was just another explosion. The gavel cracked against the sounding block. Lawson flinched as if he had been struck across the jaw. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, his mouth opening and closing silently. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess." Jason was sweating through the underarms of his cheap dress shirt. Arthur dragged a heavy hand down his face, his jaw working furiously, his eyes wide and panicked. They stared at me. The entire gallery stared at me. They thought I was soaking it in. The big reveal. The grand moment of triumph where the outcast daughter finally proved her worth to the men who threw her away. I closed my eyes. The smell of Lawson's stale coffee and the courtroom's lemon pledge vanished instantly. The rattling of the commercial AC unit faded into a low, terrifying hum. The wooden gavel hit the block again. But in the absolute darkness of my mind, it wasn't wood hitting wood. It was a high-explosive 120mm mortar shell slamming into the reinforced concrete wall of a forward operating base. Fallujah. 3 years ago. Dust choked the air thick and yellow. The heavy metallic stench of fresh blood mixed with the chemical burn of cordite and raw diesel fuel. The triage tent was a chaotic slaughterhouse. Rows of canvas cots lined the packed dirt floor. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of a portable ventilator cut through the shouting of the medics. Corporal Miller lay on the third cot. He was 19 years old, a kid from somewhere in Iowa who liked to talk about his grandfather's farm. His right leg ended in a jagged red ruin just below the knee. Thick combat gauze was soaked completely black. He was pale, the color of old wax. He was shivering violently in the 110-degree heat, his body rapidly dumping into hemorrhagic shock. In the far corner, Lieutenant Davis sat propped up against a wooden supply crate. He took a piece of shrapnel to the shoulder. It was a clean wound, not life-threatening, but Davis was the signal's intelligence officer. Around his neck on a heavy steel chain, he held the encryption keys for the entire battalion's communication grid. Outside the tent, the deafening rhythmic thud of a UH-60 Blackhawk rotor chewed through the thick desert air. Medivac. The combat medic, a guy whose face was a mask of soot and somebody else's blood, grabbed the front of my armor vest. He had to scream over the violent noise of the rotors. "One seat left, Major. We are maxed out on weight. Who goes?" He looked at me. I was the ranking officer. I was the one who had to make the call. I looked at Miller. The kid was clutching his stomach, his eyes wide, terrified, pleading. He wanted his mom. He wanted to go home. I looked at Davis. The radio keys. If those keys stayed behind, if the grid went down, an entire infantry company would be blind and deaf in a hostile sector. 300 men would be sitting ducks in the dark. It was a simple math equation. Tactical doctrine dictated the answer. My heart screamed to put the dying kid on the bird. My training overrode my heart. The discipline crushed the empathy. I raised my right hand. It did not shake. I pointed a rigid finger directly at Davis. "Get the lieutenant on that bird. Now!" The medic didn't argue. He signaled 2 corpsmen. They grabbed Davis under the arms and hauled him out into the blinding dust storm of the rotor wash. Miller didn't scream. He didn't curse at me. He just stared. As the chopper lifted off, taking his only ticket out of hell, his eyes locked onto mine. It was the absolute crushing despair of a boy who just realized he was going to die on a dirt floor because his commanding officer did the math. I stood there. I watched him bleed. I did my duty. 2 days later, Miller went into septic shock. The infection burned through his remaining blood supply. He died quietly at 400 hours. The steady flatline tone of the monitor was the only sound in the tent. 6 months later, I stood on a perfectly manicured parade deck in San Diego. The sky was a brilliant, careless blue. A brass band played marching tunes. A 2-star general stepped up to me. He smiled a perfect white smile and pinned the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal to the breast of my dress uniform. For exceptional meritorious service, for securing the communication grid under hostile fire and saving the lives of 300 Marines. The heavy metal of the medal felt like a block of ice against my skin. It felt like a gravestone. I shook the general's hand. I stared straight ahead for the camera. That night I went back to my off-base apartment. I unlocked the door, walked straight into the bathroom, and ripped the uniform off my body. I threw the jacket, the medal, the ribbons into a crumpled heap in the corner. I turned the shower on, full cold. I sat down on the hard white fiberglass floor of the tub. The freezing water beat down on my head, plastering my hair to my skull, running down my back. I grabbed a rough nylon bristle brush from the shower caddy. I dug it into my hands. I scrubbed my palms, my knuckles, my fingers. I scrubbed until the skin broke, until pink water swirled down the drain. You can wash off dirt. You can scrub off dried blood and cordite. You cannot wash off the look in a 19-year-old boy's eyes when you tell him his life is worth less than a radio frequency. That is the real price of a title. It is not a flex. It is not something you use to win a petty argument in an air-conditioned room. It is a brand burned deep into the tissue of your soul, a permanent reminder of what you traded away to become a leader. I opened my eyes. The harsh fluorescent light of the Ohio County Courthouse flooded my vision. The heavy oak paneling. The squeaky leather chairs. Lawson had collapsed completely into his seat. He was rubbing his temples, looking physically ill. Jason was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat looking for an exit. Arthur stared at me. His face was the color of dirty snow. His thick mechanic's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the wooden table. They thought I was sitting here enjoying this. They thought I was soaking in the humiliation of the men who had spent 3 decades treating me like garbage. They had no idea. They were fighting over a few $1,000,000, a lake house, a pickup truck. They lived in a tiny, safe, pathetic little bubble. I had just walked back from hell. I took a slow, deep breath through my nose. I pushed the ghosts down. I locked them away in the dark concrete basement of my mind where they belonged. My right thumb moved automatically. It traced the thick, jagged scar on my left wrist, a physical anchor to the present moment, grounding me. The cold control washed over me again. The military armor locked back into place, sealing away the bleeding civilian underneath. I placed my hands flat on the wooden table. I pushed the heavy chair back. I stood up. My spine was a steel rod. My shoulders squared perfectly to the front. I looked up at Judge Bennett. I completely ignored the 3 panicked men sitting to my left. "Your Honor," I said. My voice was dead calm. It echoed sharp and clear in the silent room. "Request permission to begin cross-examination." Mrs. Martha Reynolds gripped the edge of the wooden witness box. Her knuckles were bone white. She was in her late 60s, wearing a faded floral blouse that smelled faintly of mothballs and stale lavender soap. She lived 3 houses down from the colonel. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously across the courtroom. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at the plaintiff's table. She was looking at Arthur. I watched my father. He sat leaning forward, his heavy arms resting on the table. He caught her eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. A silent, physical command. It was a microscopic movement, but it told me everything I needed to know. He was coaching a neighbor to commit perjury under oath. He was actively orchestrating a lie to steal the very last thing my grandfather wanted me to have. Looking at him, any lingering trace of a daughter's grief evaporated. In Arthur's eyes, I wasn't a human being. I wasn't his flesh and blood. I was just a jammed lock standing between him and a vault of cash. I stepped out from behind the defense table. My boots made a slow, heavy, measured sound against the hardwood floor. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the witness stand. "Mrs. Reynolds," I said. My voice was entirely flat. "You just testified under oath that you saw me visiting my grandfather's house continuously throughout the summer of last year. You claimed you saw me through your kitchen window, whispering to him on the porch, isolating him from his son." "Yes," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. She shot another desperate glance at Arthur. "Yes, I saw you, almost every day." I did not pace. I did not raise my voice. I reached into the manila folder in my left hand and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. Smack! I slapped the paper face up onto the wooden ledge of the witness box. The sharp sound made her jump. Dead center at the top of the page was the red embossed seal of the United States Department of Defense. "Those are my official deployment orders," I said. "From March 12th to September 30th of last year, I was stationed at Camp Schwab, Okinawa, Japan. I was 7,000 miles away, locked down on a military installation." I leaned in, dropping my voice to a whisper that carried perfectly through the silent room. "How exactly did you see me on a porch in Ohio, Mrs. Reynolds?" She froze. The color drained completely from her wrinkled face. She opened her mouth, but only a dry clicking sound came out. She looked at Arthur. Arthur looked away, his jaw tightening. He hung her out to dry. "No further questions for this witness," I said, turning my back on her. Reynolds scurried out of the box like a beaten dog. I walked over to the evidence cart parked near the clerk's desk. I hit the power button on the digital projector. The cooling fan whirred to life, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. A harsh, bright square of white light hit the projection screen on the far wall. "Let's talk about isolation," I said. I grabbed a wireless mouse from the cart. Click. A massive spreadsheet filled the screen. 8 years of Federal Credit Union bank statements, high-resolution scans. Every withdrawal was highlighted in bright neon yellow. Jason shifted in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. Between 2016 and the time of my grandfather's death, 52 wire transfers were initiated from his primary trust account, I said. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, reading the hard data. $4,000 to Ford Motor Credit, $12,000 to Harrah's Casino in Las Vegas, $6,000 to a bail bondsman in Cuyahoga County. I slowly turned around and looked directly at my brother. Jason was shrinking. The arrogant golden child who had blown his cheap coffee breath in my face 3 hours ago was gone. He sank deep into the leather chair, his chin touching his chest. Sweat pooled in the deep creases of his forehead. You claimed in your affidavit that the colonel was isolated, that he was abandoned by his family. I said, my voice carrying the mechanical precision of a firing squad. So who paid off your gambling debts for 8 straight years? Who kept your truck from being repossessed? A ghost? Jason closed his eyes. He didn't say a word. Next to him, Richard Lawson pinched the bridge of his nose. The expensive lawyer let out a long, ragged exhale. He knew. Lawson was a mercenary, a shark who fed on the weak, but he was not an idiot. He realized right then that his own clients had lied to him. They had handed him a live grenade, pulled the pin, and told him it was a rock. Exhibit C, I said. Click. The bank statements vanished. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a digital forensic recovery file, a printed email exchange. Arthur's head snapped up. His eyes widened in absolute raw terror. He recognized the text. A month before my grandfather passed the plaintiff, Arthur Barnes sent an email to his son. I read the text on the screen aloud. The words echoed off the high ceiling. We need to handle the old man. The house needs to be put in my name by the end of the year. We cannot let that cash go to that bitch. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. The low, ugly murmur of pure disgust. The carefully constructed illusion of a grieving, loving family shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the floor. Arthur's hands began to shake. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his thick fingers turned purple. Elder financial abuse. It wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. It was a crime. And I had just put the murder weapon on a 10-foot screen. I turned the projector off. The room plunged back into normal lighting. I walked back to the defense table. I picked up a small black digital voice recorder. I set it down gently, on the hard wood. My grandfather knew exactly what you were doing, I said, looking at the 2 men who shared my last name. He just didn't want to spend his final days fighting the people he raised. I pressed the play button. The audio crackled. Static hissed through the courtroom speakers. Then a voice cut through the noise. It was gravelly, deep, unshakable. The voice of a man who had survived jungles and sniper fire. The colonel. The boys only come around when the collection agencies call them. The recorded voice said, heavy with exhaustion. They looked at me and they just see a bank vault. They don't see a father. They don't see a man. A brief pause on the tape, the sound of a heavy sigh. If anyone deserves it, it's Millie. She never asked me for a single dime. She just sat with me in the dark. She loved me long before she knew what I owned. I hit the stop button. The silence that followed was total. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a car crash. The truth didn't just come out. It had crawled out of the grave and wrapped its hands around their throats. Judge Bennett sat perfectly still behind the bench. He looked down at the plaintiff's table. The disgust on his face was absolute. He looked at the high-priced lawyer. Counselor Lawson. Bennett said, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you have any desire to cross-examine this evidence? Do you have anything left to say in this courtroom? Lawson didn't stand up. He didn't adjust his expensive suit. He just stared blankly at the polished wood of his desk. No, Your Honor, Lawson whispered. The plaintiff rests. Judge Harold Bennett did not look up from the bench. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy oak wood in front of him. This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be entirely without merit. Bennett's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room. The petition to contest the will is dismissed with prejudice. All court costs and attorney fees will be borne by the plaintiff. The gavel came down. A sharp, final crack. Richard Lawson did not say a word. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, the brass latches clicking loudly in the quiet room. He walked away from the table, leaving his clients behind. He was a mercenary who just realized the check was going to bounce. Jason let out a long, shaky breath, burying his face in his hands. Arthur sat frozen, his heavy chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. He had lost the lake house. He had lost the mutual funds. The golden child's inheritance was gone. I did not pack my bag. I did not move toward the door. I reached into the bottom of my manila folder and pulled out one final single-page document. I stepped out from the defense table and walked it directly over to the clerk. "Your Honor," I said, "there is one supplemental filing for the court's record regarding the estate." Bennett frowned, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The clerk handed him the paper. He read it in silence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Bennett looked down at Arthur. The disgust in the judge's eyes deepened into something entirely different. "Pity?" "Mr. Barnes," Bennett said slowly, "it appears that 3 weeks before you filed this petition to contest the estate on behalf of your family, you initiated a quiet title transfer on a commercial storage property owned by the deceased." Jason's head snapped up from his hands. He looked at the judge confused. Bennett continued reading the hard data. "You attempted to move that specific asset into a private limited liability company, an LLC registered entirely under your own name, excluding your son." The silence in the room morphed into something highly combustible. Jason turned his head. He looked at his father. The heavy sagging flesh of Jason's face trembled. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. "Dad!" Jason's voice was high and thin. The voice of a panicked child trapped in the body of an overweight 35-year-old man. "You were hiding the storage lot from me." Arthur did not answer. He stared straight ahead at the judge's bench. His thick neck flushed a deep, ugly purple. "You told me we were in this together," Jason stammered, his voice cracking, rising in pitch. The sweat on his forehead dripped down into his eyes. "You told me we had to protect the money from her, but you were stealing it for yourself." The great, untouchable patriarch of the Barnes family was entirely stripped bare. He was not a protector. He was not a stern, disciplined leader securing a legacy. He was just a petty, small-time thief who tried to pick the pockets of a dead man and was perfectly willing to cut his own favorite son out of the deal. Arthur slowly turned his head. He did not look at Jason. He looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by the desperate, cornered look of a drowning man. He opened his mouth. His breath rattled in his chest. "I never thought—" Arthur wheezed, his voice weak and pathetic. "I never thought you would become something like this, Millie." It was a final desperate attempt to play the victim. A pathetic guilt trip from a man who had spent 30 years using me as a human punching bag. I looked back at him. My heartbeat remained completely steady. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I looked at the man who gave me half my DNA, and I felt absolutely nothing. "You never really looked at me," I said. Arthur's mouth hung open. He tried to take a breath, but the air caught in his throat. His heavy hands shot up, clawing at his chest. The fabric of his cheap dress shirt tightened as he slumped forward. A terrible, wet, choking sound ripped from his lungs. His face twisted into a mask of pure agony, the color draining away until his skin looked like wet ash. He pitched to the right. His massive shoulder hit the edge of the wooden plaintiff's table. Crash! Arthur hit the floor hard. He lay on his side, his knees pulled up toward his chest, gasping frantically for air. Jason shrieked. He leaped backward out of his chair, scrambling away from his own father like the man was on fire. Jason pressed his back against the wooden divider, sobbing hysterically, completely paralyzed by cowardice. "Bailiff, call a bus. Get EMTs in here right now," Judge Bennett shouted, slamming his hand down on a panic button beneath the bench. The courtroom exploded into chaos. The bailiff sprinted down the aisle, his radio squawking loudly. People in the gallery stood up shouting. I stood exactly 2 meters away. My combat boots were planted firmly on the hardwood floor. My hands rested loosely at my sides. I did not step forward. I did not drop to my knees to help him. I did not yell for a medic. 10 years ago, the little girl inside of me would have rushed to his side. She would have held his hand, desperate for him to look up and finally love her. But that girl died a long time ago. She died in an Ohio kitchen. She died in the freezing wind at a Greyhound bus station. She died in the blood-soaked sand of a triage tent in Fallujah. The woman standing in this courtroom was a Marine, and from a tactical standpoint, I was simply observing a neutralized threat. The heavy double doors of the courtroom banged open. Two paramedics rushed in carrying a heavy trauma bag and an oxygen tank. They dropped to their knees next to Arthur, ripping his shirt open, shouting medical terminology over the noise of the room. I turned my back on them. I walked over to the defense table. I picked up my manila folders, aligning the edges perfectly. I slid them into my olive drab duffel bag and pulled the heavy brass zipper shut. I slung the thick canvas strap over my shoulder. I looked up at the bench. Judge Bennett was standing there watching me. Over the screaming of my brother and the shouting of the medics, the old military prosecutor simply gave me a slow, single nod. I returned the nod. I walked down the center aisle. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out of the courtroom. I walked down the marble steps of the county courthouse and pushed through the front glass doors. The late afternoon Ohio sun was hanging low over the horizon. The cold, practical autumn wind hit my face. It smelled like dry asphalt and impending rain. It smelled like a clean slate. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as an ambulance sped toward the building. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my contact list. I found Arthur's name. I found Jason's name. Delete. Delete. The screen went black. I slid the phone back into my pocket. You do not need the permission of the people who broke you to become someone great. You do not owe them your loyalty, your money, or your grief. I adjusted the strap of my bag, turned my collar up against the wind, and started walking down the concrete sidewalk. I did not look back. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic blood to save your own life, I want you to drop a "done" in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving the trenches of life, and I will see you in the next one.